Welcome to Dr. Dan's channel. Today we are looking at why the BRICS alliance is building its own monetary system, and what that means for the future of the US dollar, global trade, and your personal financial reality. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is not a story about overnight collapse. It is a story about power, incentives, history, and mathematics, and why the global financial order built after World War II is being redesigned in real time. Now let's set the stage. For nearly 80 years, the global financial system has operated on a foundation of trust. A system architected at Bretton Woods in 1944, where the US dollar was crowned the world's undisputed reserve currency. The logic was simple and powerful. The dollar, backed by the world's largest economy, would serve as a stable, neutral, and reliable anchor for international trade and finance. Central banks across the globe, from burgeoning economies to established powers, adopted this logic as gospel. They diligently accumulated vast reserves of US dollars and other Western currencies, viewing them not just as assets, but as a fundamental insurance policy. These reserves were meant to stabilize their own currencies, pay for critical imports like food and energy, and signal financial credibility to international markets. The entire edifice of global commerce rested on the bedrock assumption that these assets, held in trust within the Western financial system, were sacrosanct. But in February 2022, that bedrock didn't just crack, it was pulverized. Something happened that permanently, and perhaps irrevocably, changed how every country on Earth thinks about money. When the United States and its allies made the unprecedented decision to freeze roughly $300 billion of Russia's foreign exchange reserves, the move was framed in the West as a swift, powerful, and necessary response to geopolitical aggression. It was presented as a sophisticated tool of statecraft, a way to impose crippling costs without firing a single shot. The message was clear: actions on the world stage have severe financial consequences. This was the largest seizure of a major power's sovereign assets in modern history, executed with the flip of a digital switch. The mechanism was deceptively simple. The reserves weren't physical cash stored in a vault in Moscow. They were digital entries on ledgers in central banks in New York, London, Frankfurt, and Tokyo. By denying Russia access to the SWIFT messaging system and instructing their financial institutions to freeze the accounts, the G7 effectively rendered a massive portion of Russia's national savings useless overnight. But from the perspective of much of the world, particularly the nations of the global South, it was something else entirely. It wasn't seen as a targeted, justifiable punishment. It was seen as a terrifying display of arbitrary power. For finance ministers and central bank governors in Beijing, New Delhi, Brasilia, and Riyadh, the freezing of Russia's assets wasn't a distant geopolitical event. It was a direct and chilling message. It was undeniable proof that sovereign savings held in foreign currencies are not truly sovereign. They are, in fact, conditional assets, held at the pleasure of the issuing country. The very concept of a reserve implies safety and accessibility in a time of crisis. Yet here was a situation where the crisis itself triggered the evaporation of those reserves. To understand the seismic nature of this shock, we have to appreciate the belief system it shattered. For decades, central banks operated under a core set of assumptions. They believed that reserves held in dollars, euros, or pounds were neutral, rules-based, and above all, safe. These weren't just currencies. They were seen as politically agnostic instruments governed by international law and financial convention. The idea that a G7 country could, by executive order, confiscate the legally earned savings of another sovereign state, especially one as large as Russia, was considered unthinkable. It was a tail risk, a theoretical possibility so remote that it was dismissed in practical policymaking. That belief, the cornerstone of global finance for half a century, shattered overnight. The unthinkable had become reality. What made this act so particularly alarming was the nature of the funds themselves. Russia had earned those reserves through decades of legitimate trade, primarily by selling its vast resources of oil and gas to the world, including to Europe. This wasn't money from illicit activities. They were not stolen. They were not laundered. These were the proceeds of lawful commerce, the accumulated wealth of a nation's primary industry. They were the financial representation of millions of barrels of oil and cubic meters of gas, extracted, transported, and sold on the open market. The funds were then dutifully placed into what was supposed to be the safest, most liquid financial plumbing in the world. And yet, with a coordinated political decision, they were simply rendered inaccessible. The funds didn't vanish, but Russia's ability to use them did. It was a stark lesson in the difference between ownership and control. Russia might have legally owned the assets, but the West controlled the infrastructure through which those assets could be accessed and used. That single act, more than any other event in recent history, transformed the US dollar from a neutral medium of exchange into a potent geopolitical instrument. The exorbitant privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency had always come with an implicit understanding of responsible stewardship. The US was seen as the system's guarantor, not its master. By freezing Russia's reserves, the US and its allies demonstrated a willingness to use their control over the financial system as a tool of foreign policy, effectively weaponizing the trust that the world had placed in their currencies and institutions. The dollar was no longer just money, it was a statement of allegiance. And every central banker, finance minister, and head of state in the global south noticed. The shockwave was felt in every capital city that wasn't firmly in the Western camp. For a country like China, holding over $3 trillion in foreign reserves, the majority in dollar-denominated assets, the implication was profound. For the Gulf states, whose wealth is derived from energy exports and recycled into Western assets, it raised existential questions about the security of their national savings. The question they all began asking was no longer if, but when. When might their own foreign policy decisions diverge from Washington's? And what would happen to their reserves when they did? The logic was inescapable. If it could happen to Russia, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear-armed power, and a G20 nation with deep economic ties to Europe, it could happen to anyone. The too big to fail argument, which might have offered some comfort before, was now obsolete. Russia was not a small, isolated state. It was a systemic player. If its sovereign assets could be neutralized with the stroke of a pen, then no country's reserves were truly safe. The very definition of a risk-free asset had been rewritten. U.S. Treasury bonds, long considered the safest financial instrument on the planet, now carried a new, unquantifiable risk: political risk. From that moment onward, the conversation around de-dollarization fundamentally changed. For years, it had been a fringe topic, a theoretical debate among academics and gold bugs. It was interesting, but not urgent. After February 2022, it stopped being theoretical. It became a matter of urgent national security. Diversifying away from the dollar was no longer just about optimizing financial returns or managing currency fluctuations. It became a strategic imperative to preserve national sovereignty. The $300 billion freeze was the wake-up call. It signaled the end of one era of globalization and the beginning of a new, more fragmented, and multipolar financial world. The quest for an alternative to the dollar-centric system was no longer a choice. For many nations, it became a national security objective. To understand the seismic shifts occurring in the global financial landscape today, we must first journey back half a century. The story of the US dollar's modern dominance isn't just about economics. It's a complex narrative of geopolitics, energy, and strategic statecraft. It's the bedrock upon which the post-war international order was rebuilt, and to grasp why this foundation is now showing cracks, we need to revisit the precise moment it was laid. The critical juncture arrived in the early 1970s. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon severed the final link between the US dollar and gold, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system that had governed international finance since World War II. This move, known as the Nixon shock, was a response to dwindling US gold reserves and mounting economic pressures. But it plunged the dollar into an unprecedented crisis of legitimacy. Without the promise of convertibility to a physical asset, what was the dollar truly worth? Why should the world continue to accept it as the primary reserve currency? The solution was not a return to gold. It was oil. Black gold. The world was reeling from the 1973 oil crisis, when the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OAPEC, proclaimed an oil embargo. The price of oil quadrupled, demonstrating with brutal clarity that energy was the lifeblood of the industrial world. U.S. policymakers saw an opportunity within this crisis. They realized that if the dollar could no longer be backed by gold, it could be backed by the world's most essential commodity. This led to a series of strategic negotiations, culminating in a landmark agreement with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, OPEC's most influential member. The bargain was elegant in its simplicity and profound in its consequences. In exchange for U.S. military protection and political support, Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars. Furthermore, it would invest its surplus oil revenues, its petrodollars, back into U.S. Treasury bonds and other American financial assets. Soon, the rest of OPEC followed suit. This arrangement, which became known as the petrodollar system, ingeniously manufactured a permanent structural global demand for dollars. It didn't matter what the U.S. inflation rate was, or the size of its trade deficits. The core logic was inescapable. If your country needed to import energy to power its factories, heat its homes, and fuel its vehicles, you first needed to acquire U.S. dollars to pay for it. And because every modern economy needs energy, the dollar became indispensable. This system allowed the United States to run persistent trade deficits, importing real goods and services from the world and paying for them with currency it could print. The petrodollar recycling mechanism, where oil exporters parked their earnings in U.S. debt, also helped finance American government spending and kept U.S. interest rates artificially low. This was not just monetary dominance. It was a system of structural dependency. The dollar's role was no longer just a convenience. It was a necessity woven into the very fabric of global energy markets and international finance. For nearly 5 decades, this arrangement cemented America's position at the center of the world economy, granting it immense financial and geopolitical leverage. It was a brilliant strategic pivot that replaced a gold standard with an oil standard. But all structures, no matter how solid they appear, are subject to the forces of time and change. The incentives that held this system together for half a century are now beginning to shift, and the very nations that were once key pillars of this order are exploring alternatives. The era of unquestioned petrodollar supremacy is facing its most significant challenge yet. The French once called this system America's exorbitant privilege. The ability to import real goods and export paper claims. The ability to run persistent deficits without immediate consequence. The ability to externalize inflation. But privilege always carries hidden costs. A strong reserve currency hollowed out American manufacturing. Trade deficits became structural. Debt became routine. The United States transformed from the world's largest producer into the world's largest consumer. For decades, this worked, because no alternative existed. Now one does. In 1971, the U.S. closed the gold window. Money ceased to be a claim on something real and became a claim on confidence. This allowed extraordinary flexibility, but also removed discipline. Debt exploded. Asset bubbles multiplied. Financialization replaced production. BRICS countries watched this unfold from the outside. They learned a simple lesson: fiat money works until it doesn't. While the West debated ideology, China built infrastructure. The cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, now processes trillions in trade settlement outside SWIFT. It is not symbolic, it is operational. Hundreds of global banks, including Western ones, are connected. This is not about replacing SWIFT overnight. It is about optionality. And in finance, optionality is power. Since 2022, central banks have been buying gold at the fastest pace in modern history. China, India, Russia, Poland, Turkey. Gold is not someone else's liability. It cannot be frozen by a foreign court. It does not depend on trust. It simply exists. Gold is not nostalgia. It is insurance. The next layer is technological. Project mBridge, developed with the Bank for International Settlements, allows central banks to settle transactions instantly using digital currencies, without correspondent banks, without SWIFT, and without dollars. This is not theory. Saudi Arabia's participation is pivotal. Oil settlement no longer requires dollars. That alone changes everything. Finance is not just about payments. It is about credit. The IMF and World Bank operate with conditionality. The BRICS New Development Bank operates with sovereignty. Loans increasingly denominated in local currencies remove the dollar trap. This is why countries are lining up to join. The BRICS bloc controls a dominant share of rare earth minerals, major energy reserves, fertilizer and grain flows, industrial metals critical to modern technology. The future monetary system is not purely financial. It is resource-anchored. You cannot print copper. You cannot print lithium. You cannot print oil. The proposed BRICS settlement unit is not a consumer currency. It is a trade and reserve instrument, backed by gold and a basket of member currencies, potentially commodities in future iterations. This avoids the fatal flaw of the euro. No shared fiscal authority, no shared domestic politics, just shared settlement. It is closer to Keynes's original Bancor than any system since Bretton Woods. Recent BRICS expansion is not random. It includes control points of global trade, Suez Canal, Strait of Hormuz, Red Sea corridors. This is logistical power, not symbolism. The dollar faces a mathematical contradiction. To supply global liquidity, the US must run deficits. To preserve confidence, it must not. This contradiction cannot be resolved, only delayed. BRICS is not attacking the dollar. It is preparing for its limits. With U.S. debt exceeding $36 trillion and interest costs surpassing defense spending, the margin for error is shrinking. Higher rates stabilize the dollar but destabilize the economy. Lower rates stabilize growth but debase the currency. There is no painless path forward. Foreign buyers are stepping back. The Federal Reserve is increasingly the buyer of last resort. This is the inflection point. Economic transitions are rarely peaceful. History shows that declining powers resist. Rising powers hedge. The danger lies not in de-dollarization itself, but in mismanaged decline. A multipolar monetary world means less cheap imports, more inflation volatility, asset repricing, regional financial blocks. It does not mean collapse, it means adjustment. Those who understand the shift early adapt best. Let's be unequivocally clear. The dollar is not dying tomorrow. Reports of its imminent demise are not only premature, they misunderstand the very structure of the global financial system. The greenback remains deeply embedded in the world's economic plumbing. It is the primary currency for international trade, the dominant holding in central bank reserves, and the bedrock of a multi-trillion-dollar global debt market. The sheer scale, liquidity, and institutional trust built around the dollar over nearly a century cannot be dismantled overnight. To suggest a sudden, cataclysmic collapse is to engage in sensationalism, not serious analysis. The inertia is immense, and for now, the dollar remains the world's default financial language. But its era of unquestioned absolute dominance is ending. The post-Cold War period, where the dollar's supremacy was an accepted geopolitical fact, is drawing to a close. This isn't a speculative forecast, it's an observable trend, supported by the actions of nations worldwide. We are witnessing a deliberate, calculated shift away from a unipolar financial order. The weaponization of sanctions, concerns over mounting U.S. debt, and a simple, pragmatic desire for greater economic sovereignty are compelling countries to seek alternatives. This process is not about destroying the dollar, but about reducing dependence on it. It's a gradual diversification, a slow rebalancing of the global ledger that has been accelerating for over a decade. The world is moving from a single-lane highway to a multi-lane system, and while the dollar lane is still the widest, other lanes are being paved and opened for traffic. In this evolving landscape, BRICS is not a revolutionary force aiming to overthrow the existing system. It is not plotting a dramatic coup against the IMF or the World Bank. Such a narrative misinterprets the alliance's fundamental strategy. It is building an alternative, quietly, methodically, and rationally. Think of it as constructing a parallel financial architecture. Through initiatives like the New Development Bank, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, and the development of interconnected local currency payment systems, BRICS is creating options. It's a pragmatic response to a perceived over-concentration of power. This isn't about ideology, it's about resilience. It provides a safety net, an alternative set of rails for trade and investment that can function independently of the Western-led framework. This methodical construction allows member states and others who may join them to de-risk their economies from geopolitical shocks and unilateral policy decisions originating from Washington. History provides a crucial lesson here. Major monetary systems rarely, if ever, end in a sudden, chaotic implosion. They end in replacement. The decline of the British pound sterling as the world's reserve currency wasn't a single event, but a multi-decade process. As Britain's economic power waned after 2 world wars, the United States grew. The dollar didn't violently usurp the pound. It gradually became the more attractive, stable, and reliable option for a world rebuilding itself. The transition was formalized at Bretton Woods, but the underlying economic reality had been shifting for years. An alternative had been built, tested, and proven superior before the old system was formally retired. The end came not with a bang, but with a handover. Therefore, the question is not whether the world will change. It already is. Every central bank that increases its gold reserves, every bilateral trade settled in local currencies, every new member that joins the BRICS alliance is a data point in this global transformation. This is not a future event to be debated. It is a present reality to be analyzed. The tectonic plates of the global financial order are in motion. The friction is generating political heat, but the movement itself is undeniable. The real question is whether societies, and the individuals within them, will recognize this transition in time. Will we continue to operate under the assumptions of the 20th century, or will we adapt our thinking to the realities of the 21st? Acknowledging this shift is the first step toward navigating it, both for policymakers managing national economies and for individuals planning their financial futures. Ignoring it, or dismissing it as fringe theory, is to risk being caught on the wrong side of a historical turning point. If you found this analysis useful for understanding the complexities of our time, I invite you to subscribe to Dr. Dan's channel. We are dedicated to providing clear, in-depth, and non-partisan breakdowns of the critical forces shaping our world, moving beyond the headlines to reveal the underlying mechanics of change. Like this video if it helped clarify your thinking on this pivotal issue. And consider sharing it with a friend or colleague who still believes the global financial system is, and always will be, frozen in time. Fostering an informed conversation is more important now than ever. We are living through a profound transition from a unipolar to a multipolar financial world. This is not a crisis, but a rebalancing. It is one of the defining stories of our lifetime. Understanding it is no longer optional, it is essential.